Well, hey, what is up, guys? Hope that y'all are doing well and have had a good weekend. We are continuing our therapy session series tonight, and some of you may have saw that we're talking about the issue of fear. And fear is something that we all deal with. We all are afraid of things in our lives. We have little fears that we deal with. Let me ask, how many of you, when you were a little kid, you used to get scared at night when you would turn off the lights? Can anybody relate to that? Okay, a lot of people. If you didn't raise your hand, I don't know. Some people like the dark, I guess, but that's kind of sad. So some of you are like, yeah, no, I'm still scared of the dark, even now. But there's just something about darkness. When a room is completely dark, it just immediately is like a different vibe than the light. And it's like, it's Halloween weekend, right? And so Halloween was yesterday. And obviously, when you go to a haunted house, it's always going to be dark. Like a haunted house in the light wouldn't be scary. Like it might just be kind of creepy, like weird. Like why are you scaring me in the light? But darkness is just inevitable. Like it's always going to be more scary. And so I know for me, when I was a little kid, I grew up in a 2-story house. And so there were plenty of times where even when I was in middle school and high school, not super little, I would stay up later than everyone else. And so all of our bedrooms were upstairs. And so when I would turn off the lights, the light switch was right in the kitchen, the hallway was right in front of me to go up the stairs. And when I would turn the lights off, man, it was like a race up the stairs. I got to get to my room where there's some light. And so I would put the switch and take off and run up the stairs, even as an 18-year-old kid probably. And so, of course, now as a grown man, I don't do that anymore. Because I'm a man, and so a dark house doesn't scare me anymore. But now, instead of a dark house, it's a dark alley. And so when I take the trash out at night, man, that alley behind my house at night, you will never see me more alert and more ready for war than when I'm taking out the trash at night in that alley. I'm at the back gate, and I'm that latch, and I'm ready to go. No, I don't actually take a gun out there, but. Man, when I'm out there, I am fear-driven. I'm I got to get to the dumpster, okay? It's 30 yards away. I can make it. Is there anybody out here? And I'm checking because it's just a dark alley, and something about it is kind of creepy. If my neighbor ever happens to take out the trash at night at the same time as me, they might get shot. No, I'm just kidding. I really don't take my gun out there. But we will fight because in the alley, any movement is a threat. And so, but anyways, the reason why I share these things and these stories is because when it came to turning off the lights and then running up the stairs when I was a little kid, and now as a grown man, when it comes to taking out the trash in the dark alley, as silly as it is, I was and am fear-driven in how I do those things. The way that I go about it, I'm driven by fear. And so I would sprint up the stairs because I don't know what it was, but when the lights were on, nobody was across the house. But when the lights go off, there's definitely somebody over there trying to kill me. And so it's just I was fear-driven when I would do that. And now, taking out the trash, I'm fear-driven. And the truth is that for many of us in our lives, we are fear-driven in a lot of areas. We are driven by fear and the way that we carry ourselves and the things that we go after and the precautions that we take and the things that we think about the most. We're fear-driven. And some of us are so fear-driven, we don't even realize it, and we're actually thriving in our fear. But eventually, that's going to cause problems. And eventually, that's going to catch up to you. And in the meantime, if you're living by fear, then you can't be living by faith. And so the two, you can't live by one and live by the other at the same time. And I think fear is a pretty big issue that kind of goes unspoken a lot. And I know that we all have fears that we battle, some of us more than others. But at the same time, if you're a believer, we know that in God's word, he says over 200 times, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. God says that we have nothing to fear. And so when we allow fear to run and fuel certain areas of our lives, the reality is that we're not trusting God. The good news, though, is that we don't have to live in fear, and fear doesn't have to control us. And I want to say that feeling afraid and having feelings of fear, there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to be afraid. It's just what we do with that fear that matters. Do we allow that fear to consume us and stick around? Do we live in fear? Do we live in fear, worried about the future, worried about outcomes, worried about all kinds of things? We don't want that fear to consume us. That's when it becomes a problem. But that being said, it's okay to have those moments and to wrestle with it. And obviously, we're going to encounter things in life that they're going to cause us to be afraid. But the problem is when it consumes us, when it begins to drive us, and we're actually living out of fear and doing things out of fear. And so tonight, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 14. And we're going to look at a couple of things surrounding fear. And you can turn to that passage. It'll be on the screen, and we're not going to read the whole thing up front. But we're going to be looking at what fear causes us to do and some things related to fear, but then also we're going to look at what God says about fear and some important truths for us to know when it comes to dealing with that. And so in Exodus 14, I'm going to just read verses 1 through 5 to get us started. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses," that's how you say it, "between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon, you shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And they did so. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" And so the first thing that we're going to see from that is that fear happens when you feel like you have no control. In verse 3, it says that the Israelites, that they were going to be shut in by the wilderness. They were going to come to a place to where Pharaoh's army was going to be in one direction and the sea was going to be in the other, and they were going to be trapped. They were going to be shut in, is what it says. And so when I think about that, I start thinking about what it feels like to be claustrophobic. Like when you're stuck in a tight space and you feel like you have nowhere to go and there's nothing you can do about it and you're completely out of control. And I think a lot of people deal with spiritual claustrophobia. You have a lot of things going on in your life emotionally and spiritually and mentally that you're trying to handle, but you feel like you are completely out of your control and it's just you're stuck where you are. And the Israelites, they're going to experience this. God says, like, they're going to be stuck, and Pharaoh's going to see that. And the Israelites, God's people, they're going to realize that they have no control. They're going to realize that this situation is out of their control. And naturally, we, as humans, we tend to get fearful or afraid when we realize that we don't have control. Like for me, recently, like I've been sharing with y'all throughout the semester how my wife is pregnant. We're having our first kid. And by the way, we did find out it is a girl, so we're having a girl. And her name's going to be Hallie Jade. And when we found out that we were having Hallie way back in July, at the time when we found out Tori was only about a month pregnant. And so I immediately, though, I was happy and I was excited. And I was just thinking about all these things. But I also, when we found out, I immediately started to have fear and worry of a miscarriage. I knew that miscarriages are actually a lot more common than you would think. When you get married and you start thinking about having kids and you start knowing other people that are married, they're actually really common. Losing the baby in the womb. Like my parents, they had two before they had my older sister and then me, and several people in Tori's family have had them, and I have friends that have had miscarriages, and like that was, for me, like I immediately started living in fear of that happening. And so for weeks, usually it's once you get out of the first trimester, the chances go way down and it's very rare. And so for weeks, I was kind of living in fear, like, man, like what if at the next doctor's appointment they can't like find a heartbeat? And I was just, in my mind, I was constantly fearful of that happening. And so for weeks, we had an appointment at weeks 6 or 7, and we saw the heartbeat. And I was like, okay, I can breathe. Like she's okay. And then a few weeks later, we were having another appointment, and we had an ultrasound. And I was like, okay, good, we heard a heartbeat. But every week, every few weeks, I was just in fear, worried about losing the baby. And so much so that I wasn't really enjoying the moment, and I wasn't really getting to experience a lot of the excitement because I was just waiting around in fear instead of trusting God. Worried that we would lose the baby instead of celebrating the life and trusting God to take care of her. And I know for you, there could be areas in your life where you're just kind of waiting around in fear of the outcome of a situation that you're dealing with right now. But here's the thing, like, Tori's pregnancy is 9 months long. And for the most part, it's 100% out of my control. Like, all I can do is maybe help her try to sleep better. I can, make sure she's generally healthy, but I can't do anything. Like, as a man, you'll kind of realize, like, when she gets pregnant, all you can kind of do is kind of try to serve her, but you're not doing anything. The woman is the one who's making the baby. And so for 9 months, like, I can't live in fear for 9 months, worried about the baby and what could happen. I mean, I could, but, like, at what cost? Like, do I want to give up my joy and my mental health and my sleep and my ability to be present because I'm just fearful of the future? Like, I don't want that. And I know that none of you want that either. Like, you don't want to live in fear and something that you might be going through, but yet it's so easy to fall into. And for me, like, I can either live in fear because I have no control, or I can take those fears to God because He is in control, and I can trust Him to take care of my wife and my baby. Either way, I'm not in control. But one option makes me a ball of stress and fear for 9 months, and then the other option gives me comfort and peace when my fears arise. And I've been trying to cling to the second option there. And so I don't know, where in your life do you fear what you can't control? I don't know what area it could be for you. It could be something school-related. It could be relationships. It could be someone's health in your family or your own health. Or it could be a lot of things for you. It could be future. It could be fear of rejection. It could be all kinds of things that we can allow fear to kind of consume us just because it's a situation that's out of our control. But when we don't have control, that can either drive us to a place of fear or drive us to a place where we trust God and lean into God more. And we've got to decide which route we want to take. And for the Israelites, what we're going to see here is that God's going to do a miracle here. God is going to show His power and His might in this passage that we're looking at tonight, something that we still talk about thousands of years later. And I know that for all of us, like, we want to see God move powerfully in our lives. We want to see God do what we can't do, but oftentimes when we are living in fear, we can miss out on some of those moments. Instead of trusting in God and looking for Him to work and waiting for Him to work and move, we can allow that fear to consume us. But God is going to show His power here, and He's going to show His power even in the Israelites' weakness. Even when they weren't in control, He is. And we're going to see that as we move forward. And so what area of your life is fear consuming you because you're not in control? And I believe tonight that you need to let that go so that you can see God move. And the next thing that we're going to see is that fear happens when we feel like something is coming toward us for harm. We're going to look at verses 6 through 10. It says, "So he made his chariot ready, his chariot, and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord." What the Israelites saw before them, obviously, that would cause all of us to be afraid. Like you see this massive army, you're talking 600 chariots, and then all the other chariots with the full army surrounding them, and it's coming at them to either kill them or capture them. Like if you looked up and saw that and you were trapped, that's going to cause you to be pretty terrified, pretty afraid. And so the thing is, though, is that even when we are afraid for very legitimate reasons, we got to ask, who or what do we look to when that happens? When we are afraid, when I am afraid, who do I look to? When a situation's out of my control, who do I look to? When I feel like something is coming my way or that's already in my life that's going to harm me, where do I look? Who do I look to? Because oftentimes I know that for me, I have looked to the world and it hasn't done anything for me. And I had to just sit there in my fear alone, trying to figure it out, trying to deal with it. And for the Israelites, when they were afraid, They looked up, and that fear, it consumed them, and it overwhelmed them, and they cry out to the Lord, but they doubt him, and we're going to see that later on. But I know many of the times in my life when I've been afraid or fearful that something was going to come and harm me or keep harming me, a lot of times it was something that I allowed to enter into my life in the first place. And I've shared a lot about it this semester, so I won't go into detail, but once I was set free from an addiction that I had to pornography, I was free from it, but I was afraid and I was fearful that the effects of it would stick around for a long time. I was fearful that the impacts of it would continue to haunt me throughout my life. I had a fear that it would just continue to be around and continue to affect my mind and all those things moving forward. And I was fearful of that, something that I had allowed to come into my life. And I know tonight in this room, maybe there are people in here who recently, like you've made a mistake, or you've made a lot of mistakes in your past, and you're afraid of how that's going to affect you moving forward. Maybe you've made a lot of mistakes and you're afraid of how God's going to see you, of how God will respond to you if you brought that to him, even though he already knows and already sees. A lot of us were fearful of the outcome of things and mistakes that we've made. Just like I was. That was me. I was afraid of how something that I did was going to affect me moving forward. And that doesn't make my fear false. But my response to that fear needs to be to surrender it to God. If I want to escape or find refuge from the things in my life that are harming me, like scars from a bad relationship and things from an addiction, like those are self-inflicted things, that I need to surrender those things to the one who can protect me moving forward. I need to surrender those things to the one who has an answer to my fears moving forward. And so tonight, maybe you have a fear in your life because of something that you've done. And I believe that tonight you can bring that to God. You can surrender that to him because he can handle our fears. Now, this isn't the situation with the Israelites. They were actually called and driven into this fearful situation by God. Like, this wasn't self-inflicted. They didn't ask for this. They didn't do anything to deserve this. This is something that just happened. And so you might ask the question, like, why would God allow them to be in this kind of spot? And maybe in your life, something that you're going through, you're watching someone you care about go through, and you're like, man, why are they going through this? Why do they have to deal with this? And for the Israelites, it's because he wanted to turn, for one, he wanted to show the Egyptians that he was Lord, that he was God, but he wanted the Israelites, he wanted their fear to turn into dependence. God wanted the Israelites to know and to see that they can depend fully on God. And so I mentioned that there might be people in here with fear tonight because of something that you've done, mistakes that you've made, but there's also many people in here tonight who might be afraid because of something that they're going through that you didn't ask for, that you didn't bring upon yourself, like the Israelites. They didn't do this to themselves, but God is going to use it. God wants to turn their fear into trust. And maybe that's what God wants to do with you tonight. He wants to turn your fears into trust, your fears into dependence on him, your fears into security that you can find in him, your fears into peace that he can offer you, your fears into comfort that he can offer you. I don't know what it is or how exactly he's going to use it, but those are some of the ways that he could use that in your life. There's a family at the church that I grew up going to, and Leanne and Corey Edelman, and they've got two daughters, and they, when I can't remember how many years ago it was now, but Leanne, she's, still pretty young, like in her mid to late 30s, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so, young family, two young girls, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it wasn't in the best case scenario either. It wasn't like stage 1, but I believe it was maybe stage 3. And so she, at a pretty young age, was found out that she had this cancer. And, the family knew immediately, like this, the only way through this was like this cancer, it was going to harm Leanne. It was going to break her body down, and it was going to put her through a lot of physical and emotional turmoil, and that there was really no way around that. And so obviously fear was a pretty reasonable response for them to be afraid of what lied ahead. And for Leanne, especially knowing what her body is about to go through, fear would be a pretty reasonable response that I think a lot of people have when they are diagnosed with something like cancer. And I know that they for sure felt some, but the family did not surrender to that fear. The husband, the daughters, and Leanne herself. Instead, I watched them as they surrendered their fears to God. I watched Leanne as she went through all the treatments and all the different surgeries and all the things to help fight her cancer. I watched her lean into God. I watched her trust Him more. And I watched God take care of them even in the midst of their fears. And Leanne, she still had to go through it. She still probably battled fears and worries daily, but instead of letting it consume her and break her down, she allowed it to push her closer to God. God used this fearful situation to make Leanne more dependent on Him. He used something because of this broken world, because of sin in this world, and we have brokenness, and we have things like cancer. He even used that for good. Something that she didn't bring upon herself, but He worked her fears into trust, into peace, into comfort. But here's the thing about the Israelites is that they weren't living dependent. They weren't allowing their fears to push them closer to God. Instead, they were allowing their fears to consume them. They were allowing their fears to control their decisions, to hold them down. And maybe tonight you are going through something that you didn't bring upon yourself. And maybe you've been allowing fear in that situation to get the best of you. And tonight I want you to know that God can handle those fears if you'll bring them to Him. You can bring those fears in whatever situation it is to God tonight. The fears that we all deal with are fine and they're reasonable, and some of us are going through some really, really trying things right now. But you can bring those fears to God, and God can handle those fears, and God can use that situation for good. The next thing that we're going to see about fear is that fear causes us to think the worst of situations. And I know a lot of us can relate to this, analyzing and thinking of the worst possible outcome in a situation. The Israelites, in verse 11 and 12, it says, they said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And so the Israelites, they didn't see a way out. They had allowed their fear to consume them, and so naturally they assumed that the only outcome possible was death. Like the worst possible outcome, and that's not like a crazy thought. I think many of us would likely think the same thing, like, okay, we're going to die now. But at the same time, thinking the worst of situations can become a habitual habit, causing us to constantly live in fear every time that we encounter something difficult in our lives. And this is going to cause us to, when fears arise, when situations come to our lives, it's going to cause us to, instead of trusting God, we're going to start having a lacking faith. And as I said at the beginning, you can't live by faith when you're living by fear. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I asked my first, girl out. And there was a girl I liked, and I was rejected. And so just stone cold, like, pew, 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 like she shot me down, and it was in front of friends. And, as a little 6th grader, I was pretty defeated. And I remember thinking immediately, I remember going home and thinking, man, what if no girl ever says yes to me? And I remember, man, she said no, what if I never date? And automatically just thinking of the worst possible outcome now moving forward, that, man, I'm, 10 years old or whatever, and that's never going to work out for me, such a irrational thought in the moment. But when you're a 10 or 11-year-old boy and the girl you thought was cute shoot you down in front of all your friends, you automatically go to the worst case, DEFCON 1 scenario. And so my mind immediately just drove me to the worst possible outcome. But the thing is that moments like that we could cling on to, and some people end up having a real fear of rejection throughout their whole life. People have fear of rejection and fear of not being enough for people. And we allow maybe a little moment with one person or a couple people to stick with us, and then moving forward, we are always thinking of the worst possible outcome when we encounter people and what that person might think about us and if this person's going to say yes or no. And so fear of rejection is a real thing, and it could stem from just always thinking of the worst possible outcome. And for some people, fear of rejection, it leads you to possibly even kind of shutting down. And so you kind of allow that fear to hold you back. And I guess as a sixth grader, like I could have allowed that. I think I kept shooting my shot until I finally hit. And I'm married now. But for some people, you can allow that to really hold you down. But then for some people in the room, maybe you can relate more so to always thinking of the worst possible scenario when it comes to health issues. Like you are feeling sick. Like right now, anytime anyone has a headache, it's like, oh no, they have COVID. And it's like, well, you could just have a headache, but we can do that if you want to. And it's kind of like we've become fearful of every little symptom because I don't know what it is about this thing, but like it has every symptom. So like if you have allergies and a sniffy nose, it's like, whoa, dude, you got COVID? Like, and it's kind of like one of those things, like worst case scenario. But I know I can't be the only one in this room that you're having a health issue and you immediately go to WebMD and you're like, let me see what my symptoms say that I have. And so I remember a couple of years ago, I was experiencing some pretty bad symptoms. In my gut, in my intestines, I was having some internal bleeding and a lot of discomfort, and so pretty kind of scary symptoms. And so I was like, man, you know what? Before I go to the doctor who knows what they're talking about, I think that I should go to WebMD. And so I went to WebMD and I was typing in all my symptoms, and I was like, that's it. Like I have colon cancer, and I'm gonna die. And I'm serious. Like I had all of the symptoms of colon cancer, and so I was like, "That's it. I'm dead. Like I'm gonna die, and I need to tell Tori like, hey, we should probably call the wedding off because I'm gonna die in like a year." And she was like, "You're an idiot, and you don't have colon cancer." And I was like, you're probably right. I should go to the doctor. And so I go to the doctor, and it turns out like I ended up getting diagnosed with the disease called ulcerative colitis, but a very manageable disease and something that God has kind of worked through my life. And it did scare me up front, but God has shown me that He's in control of even that situation. But initially, my mind took me to the worst possible outcome because I was afraid. And I think that we can do that in a lot of areas in our lives. Even Tori, as she's going through having the baby, like it's truly mind-blowing, the female body, what it can do, and the fact that it can make a baby. But every little thing that she feels, she's like, oh, like what is that? And she'll like Google it, and she'll like immediately go to the worst thing like that it could possibly be. Like our doctor told us last week that the baby is just a little below average, like a little small at this stage. And so she's like, what could that mean? Like, oh no. And it's kind of like, well, babies come like out at different weights, like quite a bit. So I think it'd be okay. But like everything is the worst possible scenario. And I started to think as I was working on this message, I was like, man, like what if instead of thinking about the worst possible outcome, what if instead of thinking about the absolute worst and allowing that fear to consume us, what if instead we initially went to God first and prayed that in that situation that His will would be done and that His peace would rule over our hearts and even in what could be the worst possible outcome. Like what if when I was having those symptoms with my intestine, like what if I had immediately gotten to God and said, God, I just need peace right now. God, would your will be done? Would you help me to just rest in you until I find out what's going on? Instead of allowing my fear to consume me for those couple weeks before I went to the doctor. And I thought, man, like what if I changed my thought pattern in these things? Because let's not pretend that just because the Israelites made it through and they're going to make it through after assuming the worst, that sometimes like we might actually experience the worst possible outcome. Sometimes the worst case scenario becomes the real scenario for us. For example, right now, I mentioned COVID, like we're in the midst of this global pandemic, and obviously COVID is a very real disease, and it has very real impacts on people's health and their lives in different ways. And the most obvious one is the impact that it can have on your body. And it's possible, and it does sometimes take someone's life. And that's a scary thing. There can be people in this room that maybe you know someone who has lost their life because of COVID. And we know that, especially if it's someone that you love or that's at risk for maybe various reasons or for yourself maybe, that worst case scenario, like it's a real possibility. But we have some options, even with something very serious like that, where the worst possible scenario could come true. We have some options in how we can handle those fears in the midst of a pandemic. We can look at the virus and we can look at some of the real dangers and threats that it presents, and we can allow our fear to consume us every day as long as it's around, constantly worried about it, constantly in fear of it, worried about how it's going to affect me every single day or someone I love every single day, and we can go through all the worst possible outcomes all day long, every day for the months and months that this thing has been going on, and we can live in fear every day. Or we can look at the virus and we can acknowledge the seriousness of it. And we can acknowledge that, there are possibly real worst case scenarios for us. And we can acknowledge what it does do to people. And we can do our best to take proper precautions and all those things and try to prevent the spread. But then, instead of letting that fear consume us and drive us every day and send us into a nervous wreck every day, we can take those real fears to God. And we can depend on Him through this whole thing. We can trust Him through this whole thing. Ask Him to give us peace through this whole thing, regardless of the outcome or the different outcomes that you experience. Fear can consume, or it can drive us closer to God. Fear can consume us and push us away, or we can allow God to consume those fears and we can be pushed closer to Him. And the next thing, as we kind of move into talking about what God is going to say about fear, the next point is this. Whatever it is that we fear, God gets the final say. And we're going to read verses 13 through 18. It says, "And Moses said to the people, 'Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again, and the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.' The Lord said to Moses, 'Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host and his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen.'" And so we see that God, He's going to give Moses and give the Israelites a promise. God gives us promises, and He's always faithful to His promises. He always comes through. He told Moses that He would deliver the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians. And Moses told the Israelites that God was going to make a way, and that they would see that the Lord was going to save them on this day. And God's going to fulfill that promise. God is going to make a way. God steps in and He fights for them. The Israelites' fears weren't bigger than God's salvation for them. And for us today, as His children, our fears are not bigger than the salvation that Jesus paid the price for on the cross. God has never not followed through on His promise He made to us. And what a powerful thing that we can cling to in the middle of our fears if we place our faith in Jesus. God says that we can find comfort in Him when we fear, and He will follow through on that. God says that we can find peace in Him, peace that surpasses all understanding, even in the worst of our fears, even when the worst possible scenario becomes a reality, and He follows through on that. God says that our hope is found in the cross, even in the face of death, and He follows through on that. God says that all who are weary can find rest in Him, and He's going to follow through on that. And I believe that this is the invitation tonight, that all those who are weary, who are battling fears and worries tonight, if you will bring those fears to Jesus and realize that you don't have to live in those any longer, then you can find peace and hope and comfort and salvation in the Lord and stand firm when fears arise. Even though we might not be spared from trials and tribulations and sufferings in this world, like we know that because of this broken world, the Bible doesn't promise us a life without hardship and loss. But even in death, even in the biggest of our fears, Jesus is our hope, and God gets the final say because of the finished work of Christ on the cross. For the Israelites, their fears were being turned into dependence on God. And tonight, will you let your fears turn into hope and security in Jesus? God had given them a promise before it even happened that they could cling to. And God has given us a promise in Jesus that we can cling to that has happened. We have something to hold on to that is secure, even in the biggest of fears that we might encounter in our lives. And so tonight, will you let God turn your fears into hope in Jesus? The next thing that we're going to see is that God is our light in the darkness of fear. I want to read verses 19 to 22. It says, "Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud, and there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." God was literally their light and source of protection in this situation. He stepped in, and he was the light when there was no light. He made the way when there was no way, just like he said he would for the Israelites. And I think about a time in my life when I was little. My mom and I were at home, and it was just us, and I'm pretty sure I was only like 4 or 5, and we were stuck at home, and there was a yellow jacket in the house. And I was really young, and so I was terrified of yellow jackets. I still am. If you see one outside and I see it, I'll probably be running. And so I just don't want to get stung. Say what you want. But I was terrified of yellow jackets, and so was my mom. And so probably even more so. And my dad, he couldn't come home from work to kill it. And so we're stuck in the house with this yellow jacket. And I remember my mom, she looked outside. She just happened to look out the front door, and she sees a cop driving by. And so she frantically goes out on the front sidewalk, and she's like waving the officer down. And he probably thought it was something like really serious. And he comes up, and he's like, "Ma'am, like, is everything okay?" And she's like, "There's a yellow jacket in our house." And, so he was happy to come in and kill the yellow jacket for us. And as a little kid, I remember thinking of how much of a hero the cop was that day. And I was like, man, like, that guy saved our lives. We were going to die from that yellow jacket. And I share that really light story to make a much bigger point that God is our light and our hero when we are afraid in much more serious things in our lives today. In the middle of the Israelites' fears, God showed up. God showed up in their fear and gave them light and made a way for them to pass through. Even when they doubted him, even when they weren't going to him, he made a way. He showed up, and he was the hero that day. And this is what God did for us when he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross. He gave us a light to cling to. He made us a way when there was no way. He made us a path to God when we didn't have that path. Tonight, will you see that when no one else shows up, Jesus will. When nothing else will comfort you in your fears, Jesus will. When nothing else can give you hope, Jesus can. Jesus always shows up for his children. God has never failed me. And I know many people in this room that have been through things much more severe than I, and God has never failed them. Jesus shows up for his children. His promises remain even in the midst of our fears. And so will you accept that invitation tonight? And the final thing that we're going to see tonight from this story is this. When you fear God, you don't have to fear anything else. I want to read verses 23 through 31 to close. The Egyptians pursued, and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, and not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. The Israelites, they went from fearing the Egyptians, being consumed by their fear of the Egyptians, to having a fear of the Lord who delivered them. They went from being consumed by their fears to being consumed by the love and protection of God. When we were studying this passage, it made us think of a quote from the famous theologian Michael Scott. Yeah. In season 2, episode 6, Don't Ask How I Know That, he says, "Would I rather be feared or loved? Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me." And now, why this is kind of funny, it kind of gives us a slightly inaccurate but kind of accurate truth about God. God doesn't want us to have a fear of him like, "Oh no, I can't come near him." It's a fear like, look at what God can do. Look at his power. Look at his wrath. Look at his justice, but look at the love he has for me. Look at the lengths he will go to for me. This God loves me. This God loves you. Man, I can tell you in my life, like, I hope to be in a place where people are afraid of how much I love Jesus. I want people to know that, but here's what I have a fear of, is how much God loves me and how much God loves you. When I see his power and his wrath and his justice and his might, all these things, and I think, man, that could be against me, but no, it's actually for me when I put my faith in Jesus. That God is for me. When you see what God can do here in this passage, it's pretty terrifying, but it's comforting because that God is for you. Fear of my circumstance, whatever it may be, fear of a global pandemic, fear of losing a loved one, fear of the results of an election, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of health issues, fear of my future, fear of mistakes that I've made and the outcome, fear of anything is displaced when I realize that God loves me. 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear. When I was a little kid, there was a tornado coming through my city, and I remember being so scared, so afraid. It was knocking trees down, and it was pretty bad. And I remember my dad had my older sister and I get in the closet that was underneath the stairs, and it was in the middle of the house, so it was the safest place. But there was only room for me and my sister and maybe my mom. But my dad, he stayed outside of the closet, and he watched the front door to make sure that the front door didn't blow open. And he was watching the window, making sure that nothing was flying through. My dad, he was standing watch, and he was ready to do anything to protect us. And I know he would have in that moment. That my dad would go to any length to protect his kids who were afraid and fearful of the situation. When we're afraid, when things happen in life that cause us to fear, we have a God who is fully in control, who will go to immeasurable lengths to protect us, who protects us like a good father, who's gone before us and who comes behind us, who's made a way for us. We have a God that we can bring our fears to find comfort, peace, and protection that this world and nothing in it can offer. Your fears and my fears are valid in this world, but they are overcome by our Heavenly Father. And so tonight, will you bring your fears tonight and start to live faith-driven instead of fear-driven? The Israelites, they were afraid, but they were lifting their eyes to what was coming towards them instead of lifting their eyes to the one who went before them. When you're afraid, who or what do you look to? When your fears are big, who do you look to? What do you do with those fears? And I believe that Jesus is calling us to look to him tonight, the one who's in control, the one who is on the throne. He can handle your fears tonight.